A millionaire's world is shaken when his twin babies are born black and his wife vanishes. As the truth slowly emerges, what startling revelation awaits? And if you cherish your family and love videos like this, subscribe to our channel to have 10 years of luck in your life. The fluorescent lights of Mount Sinai Hospital cast harsh shadows across Robert Sinclair's expensive suit as he sat in the private waiting room. His fingers drummed against the leather armrest, creating a rhythm that matched his racing heartbeat. The clock on the wall showed 3:47 a.m., and he hadn't moved from this spot for the past 6 hours. The pregnancy had been routine until Jessica went into early labor at 34 weeks. Despite his wealth and connections, Robert felt powerless in this sterile environment where money held no sway over nature's course. He checked his phone again. No new messages from the board members waiting on his quarterly review presentation, scheduled for later that morning. None of that seemed to matter now. Dr. Thompson appeared in the doorway, still wearing his surgical scrubs. Robert jumped to his feet, nearly knocking over the untouched coffee beside him. The doctor's expression was unreadable, professional, a mask perfected through years of delivering both joy and tragedy. "Mr. Sinclair, congratulations. You have twins, a boy and a girl. They're small, which is expected for twins at 34 weeks, but their vitals are strong." Relief flooded through Robert's body, but something in the doctor's tone made him hesitate. "And Jessica? Your wife is stable, though she lost more blood than we'd like. We're giving her transfusions now." Before Robert could process this information, 2 nurses wheeled in separate bassinets. The first thing he noticed wasn't their size or their perfect tiny features. It was their skin, rich brown and unmistakably different from his own pale complexion or Jessica's fair tone. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Robert gripped the armchair, his knuckles white. He stared at the infants, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The nurses exchanged glances, but maintained their professional demeanor as they checked vital signs and adjusted monitors. "There must be some mistake," Robert managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. These can't be our children." Dr. Thompson stepped closer, speaking in low, measured tones. "Mr. Sinclair, I assure you there's been no mix-up. These are your wife's children. We maintain strict protocols, Robert cut him off with a sharp gesture. "I need to see Jessica. She's still in recovery, sir. It will be at least an hour before but Robert was already moving, pushing past the doctor toward the recovery wing. His mind raced through possibilities, each more impossible than the last. The hospital security guard stepped forward, but Robert's status as a major hospital donor granted him access other visitors might be denied. When he reached Jessica's room, he found it empty. The bed was made, medical equipment disconnected. A young nurse was collecting forgotten items, a hair tie, a tube of lip balm, Jessica's favorite lavender sleep mask. "Where is she?" Robert demanded. The nurse jumped, startled by his sudden appearance. "Sir, the patient requested immediate discharge against medical advice. She left about 20 minutes ago." The next hours passed in a blur of phone calls and increasingly desperate searches. Jessica's cell phone went straight to voicemail. Her closest friends claimed ignorance, their voices tinged with something that might have been pity or might have been judgment. Robert's own family arrived, summoned by the hospital's notification of the births. His mother, Eleanor Sinclair, took one look at the twins and pressed her lips into a thin line. His father, Richard, pulled him aside, speaking in the same tone he used for corporate crises. "Son, we need to handle this discreetly." LL Call Harrison from PR handle what? Robert snapped, louder than he intended. Several nurses at the station turned to look. "My wife is missing. These are my children. That's what needs to be handled." But even as he said the words, he saw the doubt in his father's eyes, heard the whispers from hospital staff who thought they were being discreet. He saw his mother making phone calls in the corner, probably to her society friends, getting ahead of the inevitable gossip. The twins slept peacefully, oblivious to the storm brewing around them. Robert stood at the nursery window, studying their features. The girl had Jessica's nose. The boy's fingers curled exactly like his own did in his baby pictures. But their skin, Their beautiful brown skin challenged everything he thought he knew about his life, his marriage, and the woman he loved. A senior nurse approached him, her experienced eyes kind but direct. "They'll need names for the birth certificates, Mr. Sinclair." Names. They had picked out names months ago. Traditional family names that suddenly felt inadequate for these children who had shattered all traditions with their very existence. "I need time," he said, not taking his eyes off the twins. "Just give me time." 3 days after Jessica's disappearance, Robert entered their Upper East Side penthouse for the first time since the birth. The twins remained in the hospital's NICU, their tiny bodies growing stronger each day under constant medical supervision. The apartment felt different now. Each familiar object seemed to mock him with its normalcy, while his world crumbled around him. He moved through their shared space like a detective, seeing everything with new eyes. The living room still held Jessica's half-finished cup of tea from the morning she went into labor, a perfect lipstick print on the rim. The newspaper she'd been reading lay folded precisely on the coffee table, its crossword puzzle completed in her neat handwriting. Everything suggested a woman who planned to return. Robert found himself in their bedroom, standing before the wall of photographs that Jessica had meticulously arranged. Their wedding day featured prominently, Jessica radiant in white, her blonde hair catching the summer light. Their honeymoon in the Maldives. Charity galas where they'd posed with celebrities and politicians. Holiday parties at his family's Hampton estate. 5 years of marriage documented in carefully curated moments. But as he studied the images, something felt off. Jessica's smile, which he'd always thought of as reserved and elegant, now seemed practiced. In each photo, she stood slightly apart from him, maintaining a careful distance even when his arm was around her waist. How had he never noticed before? The sound of his phone ringing startled him. Another call from his father, no doubt with more suggestions about damage control. Robert ignored it, moving instead to Jessica's walk-in closet. Her clothes still hung in perfect order, organized by color and season. But when he opened her jewelry box, he found it empty. The substantial collection of pieces he'd given her over the years gone. A wave of dizziness forced him to sit on the edge of their bed. The mattress felt different without her weight beside him. He noticed her nightstand drawer was slightly ajar, unusual for someone as organized as Jessica. Inside, he found a worn leather-bound photo album he'd never seen before. The album's pages were yellowed with age, its spine cracked from frequent handling. The first photograph showed a much younger version of his grandmother, Margaret Sinclair, standing on the steps of what appeared to be a church. But unlike the formal portraits that hung in his family's home, this Margaret wore a simple dress and stood arm in arm with a group of African-American women, all of them smiling broadly at the camera. Robert's hands trembled as he turned the pages. More photographs followed, Margaret. Tea at what appeared to be civil rights meetings, Margaret marching with protesters, Margaret sitting in a kitchen with a handsome black man, their heads bent close together over a book. The final image showed them standing together, Margaret's hand resting on her stomach in a gesture that seemed impossibly significant. The dates on the backs of the photos placed them in the early 1960s, just before his father's birth. Robert sat back, his mind racing. His grandmother had passed away when he was young, leaving behind a reputation as an eccentric who had embarrassed the family with her radical ideas. But no one had ever mentioned this part of her history. He was about to close the album when a small envelope fell from between its pages. Inside was a key and a handwritten address in what he recognized as Jessica's handwriting. The address was in Harlem, far from their usual haunts. Robert's phone rang again. This time it was an unknown number. He answered, his throat dry. "Stop looking." The voice was distorted, mechanical. "Some doors should stay closed, Robert. For everyone's sake." The line went dead before he could respond. Robert stared at the phone, then at the key in his hand. The rational choice would be to heed the warning, to protect his family's reputation and his position in society. But the image of his grandmother's genuine smile in those old photographs haunted him. For the first time in his life, he saw a woman who seemed truly alive, truly herself, just like Jessica had in those final weeks before she disappeared. He pocketed the key and the address. His grandmother's house had stood empty since her death, maintained by the family trust but rarely visited. Whatever Jessica had found there, whatever connection existed between these two women who had challenged his family's carefully constructed facade, he needed to know. As he drove uptown, Robert couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every red light seemed to last too long. Every pedestrian could be following him. By the time he parked outside his grandmother's brownstone, his shirt was damp with sweat despite the autumn chill. The key fit perfectly in the lock. The door swung open with a creak that seemed to echo through the years. The air inside was stale but not musty. Someone had been here recently. On a table in the entry hall sat a leather-bound book that could only be a diary, positioned too perfectly to be accidental. Robert reached for it, but before his fingers could touch the cover, his phone rang again. The same unknown number. This time, he let it go to voicemail. Robert ignored the ringing phone and picked up the diary. The leather was soft from years of handling, the pages thick with his grandmother's flowing script. He settled into a dusty armchair by the window, where the late afternoon light provided enough illumination to read. The first entry was dated March 15th, 1963. Today I met Marcus again at the church meeting. Richard asks fewer questions now about where I go on Thursdays. Perhaps he has stopped caring, or perhaps he simply prefers not to know. Marcus understands what it means to live behind a mask, to inhabit two worlds at once. When we talk, I feel the weight of pretense lift from my shoulders. Robert's hands trembled as he turned the pages. His grandmother's words painted a picture of a secret life running parallel to the one his family had always known. She wrote about attending civil rights meetings disguised as charity functions, about smuggling supplies to protesters, about long conversations with Marcus about literature, philosophy, and dreams of a different future. Then came the entry that made his breath catch. I can no longer deny what I feel for Marcus, nor can I ignore the life growing inside me. Richard has been away on business for 3 months. He will never know the truth, but I will. My child will carry this secret in their blood, as I carry it in my heart. The diary slip edged from Robert's hands, landing with a dull thud on the wooden floor. His father, Richard Sinclair Jr., the man who had built their family's wealth into an empire, who prided himself on their pure Anglo-Saxon heritage, was he truly the son of the Marcus from these pages? A creaking floorboard startled him. Robert whirled around to find his mother standing in the doorway, her face ashen. Eleanor Sinclair had always been the perfect corporate wife, maintaining their family's social position with ruthless efficiency. Now she looked old, defeated. "We hoped you'd never find this place," she said quietly. "Your father, he doesn't know. Margaret made me promise to protect him from the truth when she was dying. She said it would destroy everything he'd built his identity around." Robert stood, anger rising in his chest. "You knew? All this time, you knew about this?" Eleanor moved into the room, her heels clicking on the wooden floor. "I found out just before your engagement to Jessica. Margaret's lawyer contacted me, said I needed to know the family's history before the marriage. He was worried about genetic surprises." The implications hit Robert like a physical blow. Jessica knew? She knew about all of this. Margaret's lawyer reached out to her too. "That's why she agreed to marry you, Robert. She was already involved in civil rights work, and she saw an opportunity to right some historical wrongs. To bring things full circle." The room seemed to spin around him. Robert gripped the back of the armchair for support. "So our entire marriage was what? Some sort of social justice project for her?" "No," Eleanor said sharply. "She fell in love with you, Robert. I watched it happen. But she also saw something in you that reminded her of Margaret, a capacity for change, for growth. She believed you could handle the truth eventually." Robert thought about the twins in the hospital, about their beautiful brown skin that had thrown his world into chaos. The babies, they're not a genetic surprise, are they? They're a revelation. Jessica planned this. Eleanor moved to the window, looking out at the street where twilight was gathering. "Your grandmother used to say that the truth always finds its way to the surface, like a plant growing through concrete. She believed that love was stronger than prejudice, stronger than social constraints. Jessica believes that too." "Where is she?" Robert demanded. "You must know." "I don't. But I know she's watching, waiting to see what you'll do with all of this. The person you choose to be now, that's what matters to her." Robert reached for his phone, intending to call his father, but Eleanor's hand shot out to stop him. "Think carefully about what you're doing. Some truths can destroy as easily as they can heal. Your father has built his entire life around certain beliefs about himself, his family, his place in the world." Before Robert could respond, his phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Malik, Jessica's friend whom Robert had always found slightly unsettling. Too direct, too challenging of the social hierarchies Robert took for granted. "Time to decide who you really are, Robert. Coffee tomorrow?" There's more to this story than what's in that diary. Robert looked up at his mother, who was watching him with an unreadable expression. The weight of generations of secrets pressed down on him, along with the responsibility of choosing what to do with them. His grandmother had chosen silence to protect her son. His mother had chosen silence to protect her husband. Jessica had chosen action, had forced these long-buried truths into the light through the birth of their children. What would he choose? The coffee shop Malik chose sat on the border between Harlem and the Upper East Side, a physical manifestation of the worlds colliding in Robert's life. Robert arrived early, dressed in his usual bespoke suit, but feeling conspicuously out of PLA. See among the diverse morning crowd. He watched young professionals and students typing on laptops, speaking a mix of languages, existing comfortably in a shared space that challenged everything he'd been taught about social boundaries. Malik arrived precisely on time, wearing a professor's tweed jacket over a Black Lives Matter t-shirt. Robert had always known him as Jessica's friend from her volunteer work, someone she mentioned in passing but never fully explained. Now, watching Malik navigate the coffee shop with easy familiarity, greeting several patrons by name, Robert realized how little he'd understood about Jessica's life outside their marriage. "You look tired," Malik said, sliding into the seat across from Robert. "I imagine the past few days have been challenging." Robert struggled to maintain his usual corporate composure. "You knew about all of this, didn't you? About my grandmother, about Jessica's plans?" Malik stirred his coffee thoughtfully. "I knew parts of it. Jessica and I met at a Black History Symposium 3 years ago. She was researching her doctoral thesis on hidden family histories in prominent New York families. That's how she first came across mentions of your grandmother, Margaret Sinclair." The revelation hit Robert like a physical blow. Doctoral thesis? Jessica was getting her doctorate in African American Studies at Columbia, Malik confirmed. "She didn't tell you because she knew how your social circle would react." The wife of Robert Sinclair, spending her days in the halls of academia rather than on charity boards? But it was more than that. The deeper she dug into your family's history, the more she realized the significance of what she discovered. Robert thought about all the afternoons Jessica had been at meetings, all the events she'd skipped citing headaches or fatigue. She was living a completely different life. "She was living her true life," Malik corrected. "The question is, which life were you living, Robert? The one you chose, or the one chosen for you?" Malik pulled out his phone and showed Robert a photo. It showed Jessica, dressed casually in jeans and a t-shirt, standing at a podium in what appeared to be a community center. Her face was animated, passionate, as she addressed a room full of engaged listeners. "This was taken 6 months ago," Malik explained. Jessica was leading a workshop on uncovering and preserving African American family histories. She believed that every hidden story, every suppressed truth, was a piece of a larger puzzle. Your grandmother's story fascinated her because it demonstrated how artificial the barriers between races really are. "And the babies?" Robert asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Were they part of some grand social experiment?" Malik's expression hardened. "They're your children, Robert. Jessica didn't trick you or manipulate genetics. She simply understood something you're only beginning to grasp, that the story of race in America is far more complex than the simple categories we're taught to believe in." A group of young activists entered the coffee shop, their energy filling the space. Robert recognized some of their t-shirts and buttons from organizations Jessica had mentioned supporting. They nodded respectfully to Malik as they passed. Jessica is part of something larger than herself, Malik continued. She's been working with community organizations, helping families trace their histories, uncovering connections that were deliberately hidden or lost. When she realized she was pregnant, she saw it as an opportunity to bring these hidden truths into the light. But why didn't she trust me enough to tell me? Robert asked, the hurt evident in his voice. Because you weren't ready, Malik said simply. Look at how you reacted in that hospital room. Your first instinct was to assume there had been a mistake, that the babies couldn't possibly be yours. Jessica needed to protect them fr. OM that reaction, to give you time to understand the bigger picture. Robert watched the young activists, noting their easy camaraderie, their sense of purpose. He thought about Jessica standing at that podium, alive with conviction. The group she was working with, I want to understand it better. Malik studied him for a long moment. There's a meeting tonight. But I need to be clear about something, Robert. These people aren't a curiosity to be observed. They're not a way to find Jessica, if she doesn't want to be found. They're human beings doing vital work, work that your own grandmother believed in strongly enough to risk everything. I understand, Robert said, though he wasn't sure he did fully yet. No, you don't, Malik replied, not unkindly. But you might if you're willing to listen more than you speak, to question everything you think you know about yourself and your place in the world. The question is, are you brave enough to do that? Are you ready to see the world through new eyes, the way your grandmother did, the way Jessica does? Robert looked down at his untouched coffee, now cold. The man he'd been a week ago would have dismissed all of this as radical nonsense. But that man hadn't known about his grandmother's courage, hadn't held two beautiful babies whose very existence challenged everything he thought he knew about identity and heritage. What time is the meeting? He asked. The community center occupied a renovated brownstone in Harlem, its walls adorned with vibrant murals depicting civil rights leaders and moments from Black history. Robert felt the weight of every eye in the room as he followed Malik through the door, his expensive suit marking him as an outsider even more than his pale skin. The space hummed with energy and purpose. People gathered in small groups discussing upcoming events and sharing stories. An elderly woman named Dr. Grace Thompson led the evening's discussion. Her white hair was wrapped in a colorful headscarf, and she carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades in the struggle for equality. Robert found a seat near the back, trying to make himself inconspicuous, but Dr. Thompson's penetrating gaze found him immediately. "We have a new face with us tonight," she observed, her voice carrying easily through the room. "Would you care to introduce yourself?" Robert stood awkwardly, feeling the fabric of his $5,000 suit catch on the metal folding chair. "I'm Robert Sinclair," he said, his usual confidence deserting him. A murmur went through the room. His family name carried weight even here, though perhaps not the kind he was used to. "Sinclair?" Dr. Thompson's eyebrows rose. "Any relation to Margaret Sinclair?" "She was my grandmother," Robert admitted, and watched as understanding dawned on several faces in the room. He realized that these people might know more about his grandmother's real life than he ever had. "Please sit," Dr. Thompson said. "Tonight we're discussing generational trauma and inherited privilege. I think you might find it particularly relevant." What followed was 2 hours that shook the foundations of Robert's worldview. He listened as community members shared stories of discrimination that his social circle would have dismissed as ancient history or exaggeration. A young doctor described being mistaken for a janitor in his own hospital department. A successful real estate agent detailed how she had to hire white colleagues to show properties in certain neighborhoods. A teenage boy spoke about being followed by security every time he entered the high-end stores where Robert shopped without a second thought. Each story built upon the last, creating a picture of a world that existed parallel to Robert's own, a world of constant awareness, constant calculation, constant need to prove one's right to exist in spaces his privilege had always rendered invisible to him. He thought about his twins in the NICU, about the world they would inherit, and felt a deep, unsettling fear. During a break, a young woman named Aisha approached him. Her hijab was adorned with intricate embroidery, and she carried herself with remarkable poise. "I knew Jessica," she said simply. "She attended my workshop on intersectional feminism last year. She spoke often about wanting to bridge worlds, about the power of forcing people to confront their assumptions about identity." Robert seized on this connection to Jessica. Did she ever talk about her plans? Aisha's expression grew thoughtful. She talked about transformation through revelation, about how some truths can only be understood through direct experience. She paused, studying his face. "Your children, they're not just babies to her. They're living proof that the lines we draw between communities are artificial, that the stories we tell ourselves about race and identity are just that, stories." When the discussion resumed, Dr. Thompson directed the conversation toward the concept of allyship. "It's not enough to acknowledge privilege," she explained, her eyes finding Robert's. "True allyship requires action, requires risk. It means using your position to create space for others, especially when it makes you uncomfortable." Robert thought about his grandmother, about how she had used her position in society to support the civil rights movement. He thought about Jessica, how she had methodically worked to bring hidden truths to light. Both women had understood something he was only beginning to grasp, that comfort was often the enemy of justice. Near the end of the meeting, Robert found himself raising his hand. The room grew quiet as he stood. I want to share something," he began, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain. He told them about his twins, about Jessica's disappearance, about discovering his grandmother's diary. As he spoke, he realized he was sharing not just events, but his own dawning awareness of how limited his understanding had been. The response was not what he expected. Instead of sympathy or acceptance, he saw skepticism in many faces. A young man in the back stood up. "With all due respect, Mr. Sinclair, what exactly are you looking for from us? Absolution? Authentication? Your grandmother chose to hide her relationship with a black man. Your wife felt she had to hide her true self from you. Those choices weren't arbitrary. They were survival strategies in a world your family helped build." Robert felt the truth of these words like a physical blow. He had come here seeking understanding, perhaps even hoping to prove something about himself. But he was beginning to realize that this journey wasn't about him at all. It was about systems larger than any individual, about patterns of power and privilege that had shaped lives for generations. As he left the meeting, Dr. Thompson caught his arm. "Come back next week," she said quietly. "Not to speak, but to listen. Real change begins with uncomfortable truths." In the dim light of the nursery, Robert sat in the antique rocking chair Jessica had insisted on buying, one of the twins cradled in each arm. They had come home from the NICU that morning, and the penthouse felt different with their presence, more alive, yet somehow more daunting. The bookshelves Jessica had filled caught his attention, their spines telling a story he was only now beginning to understand. He reached for the nearest book, carefully balancing his sleeping daughter. Hair Love by Matthew A. Cherry lay on top of a carefully curated collection. Below it sat works by Toni Morrison, Maya Angelou, and contemporary authors he'd never encountered in his Harvard curriculum. Each book seemed deliberately chosen, a piece of the legacy Jessica had planned for their children. The boy stirred in his sleep, and Robert found himself studying his son's features with new awareness. The curve of his Nose echoed his own father's, while his full lips mirrored Jessica's. Their skin, the feature that had initially shocked him into denial, now seemed to hold stories he was only beginning to comprehend. These children were not a contradiction but a continuation, carrying in their bodies the hidden truths of generations. Unable to sleep, Robert began reading aloud from one of the children's books. His voice, uncertain at first, grew stronger as he progressed through the story of a father learning to do his daughter's hair. The parallel wasn't lost on him. He too would need to learn new skills, acquire knowledge his privileged upbringing hadn't prepared him for. Morning found him still in the rocking chair, surrounded by open books, when Malik arrived. His friend's expression softened at the sight of Robert with the twins, a glimpse of vulnerability that cut through their usual social barriers. "They look healthy," Malik observed, moving closer to examine the babies. "Have you decided on names?" Robert looked down at his children. The names they'd originally chosen, Sinclair family names weighted with generations of privilege no longer seemed appropriate. "I want to wait," he said. "These names, they should reflect all of who they are, not just my family's history." Malik nodded approvingly. Jessica spent months researching African American naming traditions. She believed names carry power, identity. He paused, studying Robert's exhausted face. "You've been reading." "All night," Robert admitted, gesturing to the scattered books. "There's so much I never knew, never thought to ask about." Jessica prepared all of this for them, but I don't even know where to begin. "That's why I'm here," Malik said, settling into a nearby chair. "Jessica asked me to look out for you if you showed signs of wanting to learn." He pulled out his phone, scrolling through photos. There are places she used to go, community spaces where she found connection and understanding. Places where your children will need to feel welcome. The photos showed Jessica in various settings: a natural hair care workshop, a Black history reading group, a community garden where elders taught children about agricultural traditions brought from Africa. In each image, she glowed with an authenticity Robert had rarely seen in their social circles. She was building a bridge, Robert realized aloud. Not just for the twins, but for me too. Jessica believed in the power of confronting people with truths they couldn't ignore, Malik explained. Your children are a living embodiment of America's complex racial history. They'll need to understand both sides of their heritage, and so will you. Robert thought about the community center meeting, about Dr. Thompson's words regarding uncomfortable truths. "Take me to these places," he said. "I need to understand the world my children will grow up in." Malik's expression turned serious. "These aren't tourist attractions, Robert. The people in these communities have faced generations of exploitation and tokenization. If you want to enter these spaces, you need to come with humility and a genuine desire to learn." "I understand," Robert said, though he knew his understanding was just beginning. He looked down at his sleeping children, then at the books Jessica had chosen for them. "When I was at the community center, someone said that my family helped build the systems that forced people like my grandmother and Jessica to hide their true selves. I need to understand how to break those systems for their sake." Malik stood, moving to the window where early morning light painted the city in shades of possibility. "Jessica always said that love could break any system if it was brave enough. She believed your grandmother proved that, and she believed you could prove it too. Where do we start?" Robert asked, his voice thick with emotion and exhaustion. "We start where Jessica did," Malik replaced. IED. There's a community garden in Harlem where the elders tell stories every Saturday morning. Stories about survival, about maintaining cultural connections despite everything designed to sever them. Your children will need these stories. The question is, are you ready to hear them yourself? Robert looked at his sleeping twins, at the library Jessica had built for them, at the city spreading out beyond their window, a city of divisions and connections, of barriers and bridges. "Yes," he said simply. "I'm ready to listen." The information about Jessica's planned demonstration came to Robert through Dr. Thompson during his third visit to the community center. He had just finished participating in a discussion about generational wealth gaps when she pulled him aside, her eyes carrying the weight of unspoken knowledge. "Your wife was organizing something significant," Dr. Thompson explained, leading him to her small office filled with books and protest memorabilia from various eras of civil rights activism. She called it the Heritage Project. The demonstration was meant to be more than just a protest. It was designed to be a revelation. Dr. Thompson pulled out a thick folder from her filing cabinet. Inside, Robert found detailed plans in Jessica's precise handwriting. She had been working with dozens of prominent families across New York, carefully documenting hidden histories similar to the Sinclairs. There were photographs, birth certificates, and family trees showing complex interconnections that challenged the neat racial categories society tried to enforce. Jessica discovered that many of New York's oldest families have hidden African American ancestry, Dr. Thompson continued. She found patterns of selective documentation, of children being listed as white when they could pass, of family branches mysteriously disappearing from official records. Your grandmother's story wasn't unique. It was part of a larger pattern of American history that's been deliberately obscured. Robert's hands trembled as he examined a map Jessica had created, showing connections between various family lines. His own family name appeared multiple times, linked to others he recognized from boardrooms and charity galas. She was planning to expose all of this? Not to destroy or shame, Dr. Thompson clarified, but to heal. Jessica believed that acknowledging these connections could help bridge the artificial divides in our city. The demonstration was meant to be a coming together, families from both sides of these hidden histories, standing together, acknowledging their shared past. The scope of Jessica's vision staggered Robert. She hadn't just been researching history, she had been working to reshape the present by exposing the complexities of the past. Their twins weren't an accident or a surprise. They were a deliberate embodiment of truths she had discovered. As Robert absorbed this information, the community center's usual evening activities continued around them. Through the office window, he could see young activists preparing signs for an upcoming march. Their energy and determination reminded him of the photos he'd seen of his grandmother at civil rights demonstrations, of the passion he'd begun to recognize in Jessica's careful documentation. "The demonstration is still happening," Dr. Thompson said quietly. "Jessica put too much in motion to stop it now. Families have been notified, stories have been verified, and people are ready to come forward. The question is, Robert, where will you stand when these truths come to light?" Before Robert could respond, a young woman burst into the office. He recognized her from previous meetings, Sarah, one of Jessica's closest collaborators in the Heritage Project. "Someone's been asking questions about Jessica," she said breathlessly. "A woman at the shelter on 125th Street says she's seen her recently." Robert's heart jumped. "The shelter? Is she there now?" Sarah and Dr. Thompson exchanged glances. "Jessica's been helping at several shelters," Sarah explained carefully. "Working with mothers who've left difficult situations, helping them document their children's histories so family connections won't be lost again. But she moves between locations, never staying in one place too long." "You need to understand something, Robert," Dr. Thompson interjected. "Jessica isn't just hiding. She's continuing her work. Every day she spends in those shelters, she's finding more stories, more connections. The demonstration isn't just about exposing hidden histories. It's about showing how these patterns continue today." Robert thought about his own transformation over the past weeks. He had moved from shock and denial to curiosity, from defensive privilege to growing awareness. Each story he heard at the community center, each book he read from Jessica's carefully curated library, each interaction with the diverse community she had embraced, all of it was reshaping his understanding of himself and his place in the world. "When is the demonstration planned for?" he asked. "This Saturday," Sarah replied. "Families will gather at Washington Square Park. Many are bringing documentation, photographs, letters, birth certificates. Some are meeting relatives they never knew existed. It's exactly what Jessica envisioned, a moment of recognition and reconciliation." Robert stood, moving to the window. Below, the young activists were practicing their chants, their voices rising with conviction. He thought about his children at home with the nanny, about the world they would inherit, about the choice he now faced. "I need to find her before Saturday," he said. "Not to stop her, but to understand. To be part of this the right way." Dr. Thompson's voice was gentle but firm. "Sometimes understanding comes through action rather than conversation. Your presence at the demonstration, especially if you come alone, without Jessica's guidance, would be a powerful statement about choosing truth over comfort." A flyer on Dr. Thompson's desk caught Robert's eye. It showed a simple design, a family tree with branches of different colors intertwining, becoming impossible to separate. Beneath it were the words, "The Heritage Project," revealing America's hidden connections. He recognized Jessica's touch in the design, her ability to communicate complex truths through simple images. "I'll be there on Saturday," he said. "But first, I need to visit that shelter." The women's shelter occupied a converted row house, its brick facade distinguished only by a small plaque reading, "New Beginnings Home." Robert stood outside for several minutes, watching women and children come and go through the heavy security door. Each face carried a story, he realized, just as complex and meaningful as the histories Jessica had been uncovering in privileged families. The shelter's director, Ms. Washington, met him in a small office that doubled as a children's playroom. Crayon drawings covered the walls, their bright colors contrasting with the serious expression on her face as she evaluated him. Robert recognized the look. He'd seen it at the community center, in the eyes of people who knew his name but needed to judge his intentions for themselves. "Jessica warned me you might come," Ms. Washington said, adjusting her reading glasses. "She said you were on a journey of understanding, but that you needed to take each step yourself." The confirmation that Jessica had anticipated his arrival struck Robert deeply. Even in her absence, she was guiding his transformation, creating a path for him to follow. "Is she here now?" Ms. Washington's expression softened slightly. "She was here this morning, working with our mothers on their family documentation project. Many of these women have lost touch with their families, either through circumstance or choice. Jessica helps them piece together their histories, ensure their children will know where they come from." She pulled out a thick binder, opening it to reveal carefully organized family trees and photographs. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a particular page. "This mother here discovered she's related to a prominent banking family in Connecticut. Her grandmother worked as their maid in the 1960s, but the relationship went deeper than that. Jessica helped her find proof, birth certificates, old photographs, letters." Robert studied the documentation, recognizing Jessica's methodical approach in the organization. "These women, they're planning to participate in the demonstration?" "Some of them," Ms. Washington confirmed. "Others aren't ready for that kind of public revelation. But Jessica believes that knowing their true history, understanding their connections to power structures they've felt excluded from, it gives them strength. It changes how they see themselves and their children's possibilities." A commotion in the hallway drew their attention. A young mother had just arrived with 2 small children, their few possessions stuffed into garbage bags. The woman's expensive clothes contrasted sharply with her desperate expression. Robert recognized the signs of someone whose privileged world had suddenly crumbled. Ms. Washington rose to help, but before she left, she handed Robert a notebook. "Jessica left this for you. She said you'd be ready for it when you made it this far." The notebook contained Jessica's personal observations about their relationship, written over the course of their marriage. She described watching him navigate his world of privilege, seeing both his capacity for kindness and his blind spots. She wrote about falling in love with him despite her initial political motivations, about believing he could transcend his conditioning if confronted with unavoidable truths. The final entry was dated just before she went into labor. "Our children will be bridge builders, but first, Robert needs to understand what it means to cross that bridge himself. He'll find me when he's ready to stand with me, not just for me." Robert closed the notebook, his vision blurring. Through the office window, he could see the young mother being welcomed by shelter residents, her children already playing with others in the communal space. The barriers between their worlds seemed simultaneously more solid and more permeable than ever. Ms. Washington returned, studying his face. "Jessica is different from most of the women who come here. She chose to leave a position of privilege to expose truths that many would prefer to keep hidden. But in doing so, she's created a template for transformation that affects everyone involved, the privileged and the marginalized alike." "Where did she go from here?" Robert asked, though he was beginning to understand that finding Jessica's physical location was less important than finding the truth she wanted him to see. "There's a community gathering at the Cultural Center on Malcolm X Boulevard," Ms. Washington replied. "Women from the shelter will be sharing their stories, preparing for Saturday's demonstration. Jessica mentioned she'd be there, helping them find the words to tell their truths." Robert stood, tucking Jessica's notebook carefully into his jacket pocket. The weight of it felt significant, like carrying a piece of a map he was finally learning to read. "Thank you," he said, meaning it for more than just the information. Ms. Washington nodded. "You know, Jessica told us about your grandmother, about how she chose love over societal expectations. She believed that kind of courage runs in families, even when it skips a generation. She's been waiting to see if she was right about you." As Robert stepped back onto the street, his phone buzzed with a message from Malik. Cultural Center is where it all began for Jessica, where she first understood that personal truth and social justice can't be separated. WHE. And you're ready to hear her story. Really hear it. That's where you'll find her. The Malcolm X Boulevard Cultural Center hummed with activity as Robert approached. Through the large windows, he could see women gathered in circles, sharing stories and preparing for the upcoming demonstration. The sound of their voices carried through the evening air, strong, determined, and unafraid. Among them, he spotted Jessica, her blonde hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, helping a young mother arrange photographs on a display board. Robert paused at the entrance, taking in the scene. Jessica wore jeans and a simple t-shirt bearing the words, "Know Your Roots," so different from the carefully curated designer outfits she'd worn in their shared life. She looked more herself than he'd ever seen her, moving with a natural authority among the women who clearly respected her presence. When she noticed him, Jessica didn't seem surprised. She finished helping the woman with her display, spoke quietly to a few others, and then approached him with measured steps. "You found your way here," she said, her voice carrying neither accusation nor warmth. "Have you been to see the twins?" "Every day," Robert replied. "They're getting stronger. The nurses say they'll be ready to come home soon." He paused, watching her face for any reaction. "I've been reading to them from the books you left, learning about the world you want them to know." Jessica nodded slightly, then gestured toward a small courtyard garden behind the building. They walked together in silence, passing raised beds where vegetables grew in careful rows. The garden, Robert realized, was another kind of bridge, connecting urban children to agricultural traditions their ancestors had carried through generations of displacement. "I never lied to you about loving you," Jessica said once they were alone. "That part was real. It just wasn't the complete truth. There were so many layers I needed you to understand, but you weren't ready to see them." "You could have tried to explain," Robert said, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew they weren't true. His previous self would have dismissed her explanations, would have tried to reshape her revelations into something that fit his comfortable worldview. "Could I?" Jessica challenged gently. "When we met, you saw what you wanted to see, a beautiful blonde woman who could help maintain your family's social position. You never asked about my research, about my passion for uncovering hidden histories. You never wondered why I spent so much time in communities different from yours." Robert thought about the careful documentation in her notebook, about the years she'd spent building relationships in these spaces while maintaining her role in his world. "You were planning this all along? The babies, the demonstration, all of it?" Jessica's expression softened slightly. "I was planning to research your family's history. That was my academic focus, after all. But falling in love with you wasn't planned. Neither was discovering I was pregnant. Those things changed the timeline, made everything more urgent and more personal." She moved to one of the raised beds, touching a tomato plant with gentle fingers. "When I realized I was carrying your children, I knew they would be visible proof of what I'd been documenting, the complex, intertwined nature of American racial identity. Your grandmother's story lives in their DNA, Robert. I couldn't let that truth stay hidden, not when it could help other families confront their own hidden histories." "So you disappeared," Robert said, understanding finally settling in his chest. "Not just to protect yourself and the babies, but to force me to search, to learn, to understand. I needed you to choose knowledge over ignorance, truth over comfort." Jessica turned to face him fully. "Your father built his identity around denying his mother's choices, around embracing a false narrative of racial purity. I watched you follow that path, and I knew our children deserved better. They deserved a father who could acknowledge all parts of their heritage, who could help them navigate a world that will try to force them into simple categories." Robert thought about the journey of the past weeks, the community center meetings, the shelter visits, the stories he'd heard, and the truths he'd begun to understand. "The demonstration tomorrow, you're not just exposing hidden histories. You're challenging the whole system of how we think about race and identity." "Yes," Jessica said simply. "These women from the shelter, their stories matter just as much as your grandmother's. The connections between privileged families and marginalized communities aren't accidents of history. They're the true story of America. Our twins are part of that story, but only if we have the courage to tell it honestly. I want to be part of telling that story, Robert said, surprising himself with the firmness of his conviction. Not just for the twins, but because it's right. Because I've seen how these hidden truths poison everything they touch. Jessica studied his face for a long moment. And your father? Your social circle? The business empire built on maintaining these divisions. Some things matter more than maintaining comfortable lives, Robert replied, thinking of his grandmother's courage, of the strength he'd witnessed in the shelter women, of the future his children deserved. There will be consequences, Jessica warned. Once these truths come to light, nothing can go back to how it was. Robert reached for her hand, feeling the familiar softness of her skin, the new calluses from work she'd chosen to do. I know, he said. I'm ready for that. Ready to stand with you. Not just for you. Washington Square Park filled with people as the morning sun cast long shadows through the arch. Families gathered in small groups, holding photographs, documents, and stories that had been hidden for generations. Robert stood beside Jessica, their twins nestled in a double stroller as participants from all walks of life began to assemble. The contrast between affluent Upper East Side residents and community members from Harlem created a visual representation of the bridges Jessica had worked to build. Dr. Thompson took her place at the makeshift podium, her presence commanding immediate attention. Today, we gather to acknowledge truths that have been buried beneath layers of privilege and prejudice, she began. The Heritage Project isn't just about exposing hidden histories. It's about healing the wounds that secrecy has created in our communities. Robert watched as familiar faces from his social circle arrived, some looking uncomfortable, others determined. His father, Richard Sinclair Jr., stood at the edge of the crowd, his expression unreadable. Eleanor had told him about the demonstration the night before, explaining that he needed to hear the truth about his own mother, about who he really was. Jessica squeezed Robert's hand before stepping up to speak. She carried herself with quiet authority, her voice clear and strong. For generations, America's story has been told through artificial divisions of black and white, privileged and marginalized. But the truth lives in our DNA, in our family photographs, in the stories whispered between generations. Today, we speak those truths aloud. One by one, participants came forward to share their stories. A prominent judge revealed her grandmother's hidden relationship with her family's chauffeur. A Harlem community leader presented documentation showing his connection to one of the city's oldest banking families. Women from the shelter stood proudly, claiming connections to histories they had been denied. Then came the moment that changed everything. Jessica invited Robert to join her at the podium, where she revealed the final piece of her research. Margaret Sinclair. Our story didn't end with her relationship with Marcus, she explained, her voice gentle but firm. When she discovered she was pregnant, she made a choice that would echo through generations. She confided in her closest friend, a woman named Ruth Thompson. Dr. Thompson stood, moving to join them. My mother was that friend, she said, her voice carrying across the now silent crowd. She helped Margaret through her pregnancy, helped her protect her child, Richard Sinclair Jr., from a society that wouldn't accept the truth of his heritage. They created documentation listing Richard's father as Margaret's husband, but they couldn't change the truth carried in his blood, the truth that has emerged so beautifully in his grandchildren. Robert watched his father's face as the revelation landed. Richard Sinclair Jr., who had built his life around notions of racial purity and social hierarchy, staggered slightly. Eleanor moved to support him, her arms steady around his waist. Jessica continued, her voice strong with conviction. When I began researching the Sinclair family history, I discovered this connection. But I also found something more, a pattern repeated across New York's most privileged families. The stories we're hearing today aren't aberrations. They're America's true history. The lines we draw between communities are illusions, maintained by power structures that benefit from our division. She turned to Robert, her eyes filled with both love and challenge. Our children aren't just our future. They're our history made visible. They carry in their beautiful brown skin the truth that their great-grandfather Marcus and their great-grandmother Margaret knew, that love doesn't recognize the boundaries society creates. Robert took the podium, his voice shaking slightly before finding its strength. For weeks, I've been learning about identity, privilege, and the courage it takes to face uncomfortable truths. My grandmother chose love over society's expectations. My wife chose truth over comfort. Today, I choose to stand with them, to acknowledge all parts of my heritage and my children's heritage. The crowd's reaction rippled outward, murmurs of recognition, tears of understanding, moments of profound connection as similar stories emerged. Robert watched his father sink onto a park bench, decades of carefully maintained identity crumbling in the face of undeniable truth. Jessica addressed the gathering one final time. The Heritage Project isn't ending today, it's just beginning. Each story shared here opens doors for others to step through. Each truth acknowledged helps heal wounds that have festered in silence. Our children will grow up knowing all parts of their history, understanding that their existence is not a contradiction but a culmination. As the formal presentation ended, families began to mingle, sharing photographs and stories, discovering connections that crossed all social boundaries. Robert found himself embracing relatives he never knew he had, seeing his family story expand and deepen with each new connection. Dr. Thompson approached Richard Sinclair, carrying a photograph of her mother and Margaret together, their young faces filled with determination and hope. "Your mother was one of the bravest women I ever knew," she said softly. She believed love could transform society, one truth at a time. In the aftermath of the demonstration, Robert and Jessica stood together, watching their twins sleep peacefully in their stroller. The babies' faces held echoes of all their ancestors, Margaret's determination, Marcus's strength, and the hope of generations who had dreamed of a world where such truths could be spoken aloud. "What do we name them?" Robert asked softly, understanding now why Jessica had waited. She smiled, tears gleaming in her eyes. "Margaret Ruth for our daughter," she said, "and Marcus Richard for our son. Names that honor all parts of their heritage, all pieces of their story." Around them, the park continued to buzz with conversations, connections, and revelations. The Heritage Project had torn down walls of silence, creating space for a new kind of community to emerge. Robert looked at his family, at Jessica's quiet strength, at his children's peaceful faces, at the gathered crowd representing all facets of their heritage, and finally understood what his grandmother had known all along: that love, when chosen over fear, has the power to transform not just individuals, but entire generations.